John. I'm here to talk about migratory bird nest conservation. And really it's dealing with my experience as a biologist over 34 years, having conducted or overseen or managed nearly 6,000 nest searches between really 2008, when I really first started doing this associated with construction activity, and 2018. And those searches were conducted over the Canadian western provinces of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC. Now, the Migratory Bird Convention Act, I'm going to keep my discussion specific to that act. I'm not going to bring in any provincial regulations because they vary by province by province. And I'm not going to bring in the provisions of the Species at Risk Act. I'm going to focus strictly on the Migratory Birds Convention Act itself. So this act was a legislative mechanism that brought into power the 1916 Convention on the Protection of Migratory Birds. Now this convention was unique. It was the first international treaty between Canada and the US regarding wildlife conservation, and really focused on hunting and commercial harvest of wildlife. Now, part of this provision was an activity at the time called egging, which was the commercial harvest primarily for the restaurant market, as well as somewhat private and museum egg collectors and sales. Now, also, there was a commercial harvest of nests. Now, these were really built around the fashion industry as well as private and museum university collections, where nests would be taken from the wild and then sold. So the Migratory Bird Convention Act was really brought in, and part of the provisions was to control the commercial harvest of eggs and nests, with the provision in the Migratory Birds Regulation that no person shall disturb, destroy, or take a nest, egg, nest shelter, eider duck shelter, or duck box of a migratory bird. So what's the responsibility of people working in the field under the Migratory Bird Convention Act? So really it's that every director or officer take all reasonable care, and that they established that they exercised due diligence under the Act. That's the responsibility that people have. Now, due diligence is really a risk-based guidance approach. There's some very good literature on that, particularly April 2017 conference entitled Avoiding Incidental Take from Nesting Birds from Law to Practice. This was an excellent conference, and a presentation put forward by Janice Walton on due diligence and legal risks. I strongly recommend reading that. And also there's a due diligence defense and regulatory prosecutions that was put together in 2016 that really reviewed due diligence defenses in Canada as good guidance. Now, reasonable care is another process of risk-based approaches to managing issues. And it really brings out that under the Act, Migratory Birds Regulation, disturbing a nest or an egg is designated as a contravention under the Act. And really since December 2017 and then September 2018, there was amendments to the Migratory Birds Convention Act and the Contraventions Act, which made the disruption of an egg or nest, the taking of an egg or nest, a ticketable offense under the Act. That ticketable offense is $150 for the first egg or nest, plus $50 for each additional egg or nest. So typically for construction activities, a likely ticket would be less than $500. In other words, a nest with 4 to 6 eggs in it. Now this is strictly to do with incidental take, meaning you didn't know about the nest or egg was there. If you intentionally took it, then this really doesn't apply. So the typical cost of searching for a nest on a construction site and finding it is about between $10,000 and $30,000 per nest found, as opposed to a $500 fine if you actually disturb a nest was there. So this gets into the issues of risk-based due diligence and reasonable care. So let's begin with that whole process of risk-based approaches, starting with where are nests found. So the most likely place you're going to find a nest is associated with a wetland, where the literature suggests you have 10 to 20 nests per hectare of wetland and surrounding area. Now, most construction activities, however, occur more in treed shrub areas, away from wetlands, where nesting densities, literature suggests, is about 1 nest per hectare, and that's consistent with my experience. Now, a lot of nest protocols simply deal with clearing those areas, and then after that, construction is good to go. That's not my experience. I've done a lot of work on transmission line pipeline rights of ways, where once they are cleared, the nesting density increases from 1 nest per hectare to upwards to 2 nests per hectare at that stage. And then done a lot of work again, transmission lines, distribution lines. Industrial facilities are not immune to nesting. On the contrary, our substations that we work with generally have nesting densities of between 8 and 10 nests per hectare. And even during construction, does not impede nesting from occurring. So we have activities where on one site where it's a substation gravel pad where killdeer nested, even though there was daily activity occurring. On another, we have a generator where a nest was built while the generator was parked and not in use. And one of my favorites is the third picture, which shows a nesting or a work platform, wooden work platforms from electricians built for some overhead work. They pulled it away from their work area to their workbench, went home for the weekend. When they came back, there was a robin's nest sitting on it. So that platform had to remain in place for another month till the robin's nest completed. So where are nests found? Well, they're found everywhere. It's not just about clearing trees and shrubs off an area. So the next search protocol really is needed for all field sites and for all activities from the beginning of construction right through to the end. So nest searches, how and how many should you do to satisfy the need to not take a nest or an egg? Well, Environment Canada has some good tools in terms of the general when to do with both historical nesting periods and the 90% nesting activity dates. In terms of when 90% of nesting activity can be expected to occur, and they break that down by different regions. Now, within my own experience in terms of nest search results, the number of the surveys protocols we did were client survey protocols, and they required a 3-pass search. So you would do a first search, in which case generally the searchers would find a nest at about 5% of the workspaces. Second search, it would be about 1 in every 200, or about 0.5%. And the third search, it would be 1 in 1,000, or 0.1% of searches would come back with a nest at that point. So looking at the necessary effort to demonstrate reasonable care, going back to what the Act says about reasonable care and due diligence, if you do no nest searches at all, construction would be okay to occur on a site about 95% of the time. However, doing nothing is not defensible as far as due diligence itself. However, if you just do one search is conducted, you'll decrease the risk that construction would be okay 99.9% of the time, and you only have a risk of maybe 0.1% you would encounter a nest that you could not find on a single search. This generally is a reasonable level of effort. Now, if you do 2 or 3 searches are conducted, certainly you'll drop that risk down, but the amount you drop it down is just 0.06%, 0.05 for the second search, 0.01% for the third search. So you're doubling and tripling your costs and not really gaining any benefit with respect to a substantial risk reduction for such an increase in cost. So who should be searching for nests? This is always a delicate question, and usually on typical protocol qualifications, commercial protocols that are out there talk about birders conducting their nests. Now, birder is really someone that can identify birds by sight and sound. So fairly high skill to be able to do this, but it's not consistent with what the qualifications are noted in the literature. And the key literature I'm referring to is the work by Martin and Guelph, who I'm quoting the Journal of Field Ornithology, but they published in a number of other peer-reviewed journals and brought out methodologies for locating nests. And also some excellent protocols by Ralph et al., which is really U.S. Department of Agriculture or Forest Service or Geological Service in the States. Had some very good protocols that they had established for some years. So under Martin and Guelph, what is the qualifications for a successful nest searcher? And they really sum it up where they say it is persistent patience. And keep in mind that if only 5% of surveys are finding a nest, 19 aren't. So 19 out of every 20 surveys are not finding a nest. So it requires a surveyor who's going to apply the methodology over and over and over again and very rarely find a nest. So it really requires persistent patience as a key attribute. And they also note that there is a misconception that nests are difficult. Certainly that's been my experience as well, that they are not difficult to find if it is being a properly trained searcher is looking for them. Now the key qualification is again patience and alertness, and patience because of the frustrating nature of doing these surveys. So what about training? So nest searching by itself is labor intensive, but observers can be trained in their ability to locate nests in a matter of days, just with working with someone that knows what they're doing so they can understand the signs that they need to look for. And part of these signs is that the nest searcher does not really need to understand bird identification. What they need to understand is what are the signs they're looking for of a nesting activity occurring in front of them, and what is the various options of nests that they're going to be looking for, the types of nests. So what about birders? Well, birders really are following what's called the breeding bird inventory criteria, and it's really IDing birds by sight and sounds. And this method really focuses primarily on the males, with the females being very difficult to observe or identify. Now, the literature is clear that there's no correlation between the presence of a singing male and the presence of a nest. And it certainly has been my experience, particularly with Sprague's pipit in southern Alberta, where just the opposite was true. The absence of a singing male or the near absence of a singing male was an indication of nesting, whereas lots of singing was an indication there was no nest. So going back to the qualification of patience and alertness of observers, I note that when birders do these surveys, their field notes come back usually and they have 12 or 24 species that they've observed down to the species level, and they record these on it. Now, if you assume that it takes about 30 seconds to ID a bird, ID and record a bird by ear, and about 60 seconds to do it visually through binoculars or spotting scopes, birders will spend in a 20-minute survey window about 6 to 12 minutes just IDing birds. So this means they're spending a third to two-thirds of the survey window really recording information that is not relevant to the task at hand. So it becomes a question of a distraction to them as far as their skill set rather than a benefit. So who should be searching for the nest? Well, really it's anyone with an aptitude to have this persistent patience. Then they need to be trained in how to identify nesting behavior and how to do a proper physical search where you will minimize the risk of disturbing the nest itself as a result of the search itself, where predation can become a real issue. So really anyone that has this aptitude can be trained to find a nest, but if a nest is found, then you do need to bring in a specialist to develop a management. So in summary, a nest conservation protocol is needed for all field activities and sites. It should be part of the worker orientation and training. It should be conducted before any work is started at a site. And that includes after a break in activities such as a weekend or a holiday weekend of things of this nature, or just a pause in the construction activity. And it should really be part of the daily site walkthroughs before work starts. This isn't something that's just associated with clearing the activity and after that you forget about it. So thank you very much for listening to this. If you want a copy of my protocol and the full literature justification behind it, feel free to email me and I will send you a copy of it. So the Migratory Bird Convention Act put an end to that with the phrase, no person shall disturb, destroy, or take a nest, egg, nest shelter, eider duck shelter, or duck bost, a migratory bird. The Migratory Bird Convention Act defines a nest as the nest of a migratory bird and includes parts of the nest. It's important to note that the Migratory Bird Convention Act protects the nest or the egg as a physical structure. It's not about protecting nesting. This is a harvesting regulation. Now that's for if you inadvertently disturb the nest. If you intend to do it, that's a different matter. So the management of this provision falls in the hands of Environment Canada and climate change. The Migratory Bird Convention Act itself has a unique section in it, that's section 3, that says this act is binding on Her Majesty and right of Canada or a province. This means the act constrains what the Crown can or cannot do. And this is important in considering this. This is noted in a general on the Environment Canada website around nest searches. This is general information and not intended to be relied upon as official advice concerning the legal consequences of any specific activity. And this is because of that section of the Act, that Environment Canada is tightly bound about what it can and cannot say on this issue. This was further brought forward by Ken Fort of Environment and Climate Change Canada, one of the regional directors, who noted in a April 2017 conference that the department can provide tools to support decisions, but cannot endorse particular best management practices, as this could constitute officially induced error. So their hands as a regulator are fairly tied in terms of the advice that they can provide.